Well, before I tell you a story, I have to tell you a story to start with. This is a true story. When I was at Bible college, one of the men that came to speak at Bible college, his name was Gene Jackson. He was the district superintendent of the Southern Illinois district. And he shared this story with us all. He grew up in the 30s during the time of the Depression. And his father was a pastor with 3 boys, 8, 10, and 12 years old, that were very ambitious and rambunctious. And so they hardly ever got invited out, but this particular Friday night, they were invited out. And the family that invited them out had a little boy named Johnny who was exactly the same age as Gene, which was 8 years old. And anyhow, that's the story. Before I tell you that story, I got to tell you this. One night when they were heading to bed, and they slept in the upstairs, and it wasn't finished off, there was just the rafters and stuff. And so it was a great place for 3 boys to do chin-ups and jungle gyms and skin the cats and all those kind of things. And Dad's downstairs, and he's told them to go to bed, and he hears them up there carrying on, doing all these things. He said, "I said get to bed." And of course they heard Dad's voice, and they paid good attention, because there was what was called the hickory switch in the woodshed. And they crawled into bed, but it wasn't very long. They were up again doing the things, and Dad had a strict rule. He only ever gave them one warning. They heard him coming up the stairs, so they quick blew out the kerosene lamp, and all of them dove into the bed. They all slept in one big bed. And Pop walked into the room without turning any lights on, and he grabs somebody by the foot, pulls them off of the bed, and gives them a good spanking. He reaches back on the bed, gets somebody by the hair, and he gives them a really good shaking. He reaches back in, gets somebody by the arm, and he gives him a good kick in the seat of the pants. He found out the next morning he got the same boy all 3 times. That's how dark it was in Southern Illinois. On this particular day, they head to the neighbor's house, and the neighbor is actually 1.5 miles away. That's the closest neighbor. They didn't have a vehicle, so they walked. And it wasn't too bad walking there, you know. The sun was shining. It was just getting ready to set. And they got there for supper and had a marvelous chicken dinner. And the boys were watching Dad anxiously to see what happened. And they could tell by the way he slid his chair back, he meant to talk to this family for a while. John whispers to him, "Come out of my room, we'll play marbles." And he said, they looked at Dad, because they knew they couldn't do that unless Dad said yes. Dad nodded his head that they could go upstairs and play marbles. They got upstairs, and Johnny's room was all finished off, and he took a piece of chalk and drew this big circle on the floor, and he got out a can of marbles. Poor Gene had never seen marbles before, and he looked at that can of marbles, and it was like they were diamonds. They looked like the greatest things in the world. They were big shooters. There were all these little cat's eyes and all different varieties of marbles, and he counted out so many to everybody, and they began to play marbles. Gene had never played marbles before, and he wasn't too good at it, but he was sure mesmerized by the marbles. And every once in a while, one of them would get knocked out of the circle, and it would be real close to Gene. And Gene would kind of look around, and when nobody was looking, he'd take that marble and slip it in his pocket. And a little while later, he'd take a marble and slip it in his pocket. By the time Dad yelled up the stairs, "Boys, it's time to go home," he had a decent pocket full of marbles. They headed down the stairs because you didn't want to cross Dad. There was that hickory switch, and there was that back room. And so off they went, and they headed out the door, and it was dark. It was a dark Southern Illinois night. It was so dark you couldn't hardly see your hand in front of your face. And of course they were a little bit nervous, but they got close to Dad, and Dad knew they were nervous, and so he just began to whistle at him, and they all began to hum or whistle or whatever they could do along and hang on to Dad. It didn't seem like any time at all they were home. And he looked and said, "Boys, we've stayed out late tonight. I don't want any mischief. You head right upstairs and get ready for bed." He says, "You don't even need to turn that light on, because all you're going to do is take your clothes off and pop into that bed." And they all headed up the stairs, and Gene had forgotten all about a pocket full of marbles. And as soon as he dropped his pants, those marbles hit the floor. They sounded like thunder on that dark Illinois night. Of course, from downstairs, Dad says, "What was that?" Gene thought real quick. He said, "If I say the lamp, he'll be right up here." He says, "I've got to come up with something." So he yelled out, "It's marbles!" Dad hollers up, "Where did you get marbles from?" And he hollers back down and says, "Johnny gave them to me." He said it would have been a pretty good story, except Dad knew Johnny really well. He knew that Johnny was much more likely to steal marbles than ever give any away because he was very selfish. He says, Dad comes up the stairs. Doom, doom, doom. He says, my throat was dry. He says, I had butterflies in my stomach. I was trembling all over. I thought about jumping into bed. He said, I remembered what happened last time when one of us jumped into bed. He said, I thought it was best to stand behind the door. He said, Dad calmly opens the door instead of banging it open, lights the lamp, and looks at all the marbles on the floor. He says, Gene, I want you to tell me the truth. Did Johnny really give you these marbles? He said, I looked around at the marbles and I smiled and said, yes, Dad. Would you like me to pick them up? He said, yes, I would really like you to pick them up, Gene. He says, but before you do, I want you to remember that the Bible says all liars will find themselves in the lake of fire. He said, I began to pick up the marbles, and all I could think about was that lake of fire. He says, I knew I certainly didn't want to go there because I knew Mom and Dad wouldn't be there and nobody else would be there. And it was already bad enough happened to be in southern Illinois when it was really dark. So I grabbed Dad by the leg and I said, I smell the marbles, Dad. He says, I want you to get dressed, pick up all those marbles, and come downstairs. Gene says, usually boys can dress in under a minute. You hop out of bed, and with 2 feet at once, you can stick your pants on. One little hop, and you've got it going. He says, I pulled those pants on one leg at a time as slow as I possibly could. I got my shirt on, and I buttoned each button, made sure it was perfect. He said, I picked up all the marbles as slow as I could, and I got them in my pocket, and I went downstairs, and I was expecting that Dad was going to be standing by the door with that hickory switch. I'd had that hickory switch quite a few times. I knew what it felt like. I knew I wasn't going to get a lot of sleep that night because it would be hard to lay down. He says, so I was expecting that. He says, when I got at the bottom of the stairs, Dad's sitting in the living room reading. He says, so I stood at the stairs and I waited. Finally, without him ever looking at me, he says, Gene, he says, what do you think we should do with those marbles? And Gene says, I should give them back to Johnny. His dad said, that's right. He says, I can give them back to him Monday. We ride the same school bus. I'll give them to him on the bus. Dad turned his head and looked at him and said, 2 things about that. First of all, if you hang on them all weekend, we're liable to lose some. And secondly, Johnny's liable to throw them on the bus. He said, this crime happened tonight. It needs to be paid tonight. So you need to give back the marbles tonight. Gene looked at Dad and says, okay, I'm ready to go. Dad says, go. He looked at Dad and said, by myself? Dad says, I didn't steal the marbles. He says, by yourself. Gene said he opened that door and he walked across the porch. It wasn't too bad at first because the kerosene lights were shining up the dirt path and the dirt road a little ways, he said. But the farther he got, it seemed like the darker it got, and finally he turned a little bend and then there was no lights in the farmhouse anymore. He was really scared, really shook up. He remembered Dad whistled. He said that seemed to help a lot. Did you ever try to whistle when you're scared? It's just a So finally he gave up on that whistle, and then it wasn't long his imagination began to play tricks on him, and he was sure that there were lions and tigers and bears ready to jump out at him at every corner, and finally couldn't take it anymore. And he took off running for all he's worth. And he ran all the way to Johnny's house. Their lights are all off. He didn't worry about that a bit. He jumped up on the porch, banged on the door, bang, 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 and all of a sudden Johnny's father opens the door and says, what is it? He said, I threw the marbles right in the house and said, I stole Johnny's marbles. He said, I turned around and I jumped off the porch and ran all the way home. He says, the lights were still on and I went through the door and I didn't even bother to look to see Dad or anything. I went right up the stairs and hopped in bed. He says it felt good to get in bed. 14 years later, when he was graduating from Bible college, his dad takes him aside and says, Gene, I want you to know I'm real proud of you. He says, I need to tell you something. Do you remember 14 years ago when you stole Johnny's marbles? Gene says, it's one of the proudest days of my life. I'm graduating from Bible school, and here Dad is reminding me of my crime. He says, I looked at him, I said, yes, Dad. He said, I want you to know, if you would have met with any danger that night, it would have never had a chance to get you because I was never more than 6 feet behind you all night long. Lots of times we go through things and we think we're all on our own. But there's a God right there, right behind us.